One of the more common traits in the video games industry recently is remaking a game from the earlier generations. And no, I do not mean HD ports like Metal Gear Solid or Ratchet & Clank. Rather, I'm talking about games like Crash Bandicoot, Spyro, and Ratchet & Clank. Now personally, I have nothing against the idea of a new developer attempting to recreate or rather reimagine a classic from the earlier years of video games. It gives a newer audience the chance to see what was trending and successful back in the old days before the repetitive first person shooters, and it also gives devs the chance to improve or rather add on to a classic that can make them even better. Or you know, they could completely whore it out. Oh, and while that's great that they've done that, a lot of other games out there do kind of deserve this treatment more than Crash and Spyro, and one game that I've always believed needs this is a little game that I've wanted to talk about for quite some time. And finally, I think I'm ready to talk about a little gem for the PlayStation 1 called Medievil. To me, Medievil has been something I've always wanted to talk about ever since I've changed to reviews, and even more so now that the remake is right around the corner. But I think that's what makes it even more important to discuss prior to the remake, to give everyone a perspective as to why personally I think this game was more of an important remake compared to Crash or Spyro, because unlike those two games, Medievil didn't fully age that well. Now before someone does call me a cunt in the comment section for that, at least hear me out. Medieval is, and always will be in my eyes, a fantastic game. Even when I played it recently, a majority of the time it's an excellent game to play and I had a lot of fun revisiting it. However, I can acknowledge why some people who never really grew up with these games may have had a bit more of an issue playing them in anticipation for the remake. But before we can really dig deep into what's wrong with the game, perhaps first I should really give you a bit of context into what Medieval is all about. In Medieval, you play as the skeleton of a fallen hero called Sir Daniel Fortescue, a fallen hero during the Battle of Gallowmere who has been resurrected after the return of the evil wizard Zarok, and your main goal throughout the game is to make your way to his lair and stop him for good. But before you get going, the game immediately lets you know that Daniel's legacy isn't really what it was made out to be. In fact, it's a bit of a big lie, as Daniel was shot down within the first few minutes of the Great Battle, and everyone but the townsfolk of Gallowmere remembers this, and you get mocked for it pretty much immediately.
It has risen again, Sir Daniel Fortescue, see? The hero of Gallowmere who fell at the first charge. The fog of war and the shrouds of time conspire to turn the arrow fodder into the saviour of the day. But we knows better. Let it alone. Fate has given it a second chance. A chance to forget the ignoble truth. A chance to defeat Zarok and live up to the legend. We hopes it does well.
Look, he's trying his best, alright? So with him being mocked throughout the game, the story ends up becoming a two-goal scenario, with Daniel trying to save the town he swore to protect all those years ago, while also giving him the chance to reclaim the fame of being an actual hero to finally be given a place to rest in the Hall of Heroes. And from there, the game pretty much begins. The first level you're thrown into is Dan's Crypt, a short little tutorial-like level that gives you a moment to adjust to the controls, the combat, and overall get a nice feel to the game without being thrown into the deep end. The first couple of weapons you're bound to find in this game are Daniel's trusty sword, his trusty shield, and some throwing knives, and the game also introduces its life system immediately. In most games you follow the route of either having a life token system or just an endless retry. However, in Medieval it tries something a little bit different. Throughout the game you'll find these health potions that work as a bit of a backup health kit while also being a life token. If Dan runs out of health and dies, he's actually revived using up one of these potions. However, instead of just throwing the bottle away, you can then just refill it later by either finding health vials scattered around the map, or finding cracks in the floor that spew out health. It's definitely a unique way to tackle the health system, and honestly, it has no complaints from me. All I will say though is that you definitely want to explore and find these, as you actually need these later on in the game, as it makes a specific point a hell of a lot easier. So upon leaving Dan's crypt, you're thrown into the map of the overworld, which is basically a prettier looking level select screen. It's nothing fancy, but it gives you an overlook of Gallowmere as a whole, and upon getting further into the game, it works as a sort of overview of how far your journey has come. Being this is the start of the game, however, you only get one real choice to choose from. But later on, once you finish a specific level, you unlock a branching path of sorts, with some levels requiring you to backtrack through them once you've obtained a certain item. Or if you're returning to the same area, you might be starting from a different start point to make the level feel like a different level while you're actually covering familiar grounds. Now normally I do tend to have a problem with games reusing levels or just forcing you to backtrack for the sake of stretching out the gameplay, but with Medieval, the levels aren't long enough to make it feel forced. And normally when you're returning to a level, you're doing something different anyway, and you may end up unlocking another area to the level to progress through to. Plus within each level there's other things you can find. You've got gold which can be used to buy other items from the merchant, extra health vials that will either replenish your health or give you an extra life if it's in a bottle, and more importantly, within every level, excluding Dan's crypt, you'll be able to find a chalice that sends you to the Hall of Heroes. The Hall of Heroes is a reoccurring location you'll come across at the end of each level, if you do the secondary objective. Within each level, you'll have a soul counter that you need to raise to 100%. Upon hitting that point, the chalice in the map will become obtainable, and once you've picked that up and left the level, you'll be immediately thrown into the Hall of Heroes. I think my only real complaint with these is the lack of variety in collecting them. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm happy to go around and kill everything I see and also save the innocent, but only having one level in the game that has a completely different objective to this always felt a bit weird. Also, something I've never really understood is that you can't actually pick up the chalice unless you've got your soul counter to 100% beforehand, as until then it remains transparent, meaning if you see the chalice at the start of the level, you can't pick it up, you have to do the entire thing, get it to 100% and then come back to the start to pick it up. It's a bit tedious and makes the level a bit longer than it needs to be. Well, regardless of that, when visiting the Hall of Heroes, you'll actually be speaking to heroes from the Battle of Gallowmere who, unlike you, actually died in honour. And while they're a bit hesitant with you being the resurrected hero to save everyone, they don't want to leave you empty-handed. They'll offer you various items and, more importantly, weapons that you can use for the rest of the game, making the journey a little bit easier and a lot more fun. There's a lot of weapons you'll unlock in this game, with them being mixed between ranged and melee focused. However, a lot of them are considered to be an upgrade of a previous weapon you already have in the game, all except one of them that is a one-off item, and that's more for the end of the game, which if you use it up too early, it's gone forever and you can't get it back. And I actually quite like that idea. It's nice to have a weapon that's so important that you don't know when to use it. I think what I love most though about the Hall of Heroes is how it's a prime example of where this game's sense of humour shines brightly, as a lot of the people you speak to, while obviously feeling a bit dated, are still funny to view in their own way.
Alright Dan man, how you doing? Now then, have you got yourself a magic sword? What? Daniel man, you can't go into battle against an army of undead without a magic sword. Here, take mine. You'll never have to sharpen another blade, or my name's not Dirk Steadfast. It's not enough just to have a magic shield, you know, no matter what that soft ticky stern card says. Good lad. Why, I'd sooner go into battle holding a tea tray than carry that weedy Gale's shield of his.
Also, I think this is an opportune point to point out how much I love the theming in this game. One of the most common things you'll ever hear about Medieval is how the art style is very reminiscent of Tim Burton, which honestly I have to agree with entirely. However, a lot of people always compare it to A Nightmare Before Christmas, but while I can see that, whenever I think about the game, especially thinking of the levels like the Graveyard or the Sleeping Village, I always think of The Corpse's Bride.
I've got a dwarf, and I'm not afraid to use him.
Basically what I'm trying to say is, even though this game is meant to take a semi-scary route, with it being a skeleton fighting a mass army of the undead, this game has a lot of charm behind it, and it still holds up today. All except the cutscenes, that is. This isn't really the game's fault itself, rather it's a running gag with old PlayStation 1 titles around this time, where CGI was still a new and upcoming thing, and the game industry just went, hey, I think the game would look better if we used this over some other style of cutscene. And yeah, I guess at the time it kinda worked, but for Medieval, even then and still now, some of these cutscenes just kind of give me the creeps. I mean, they're not all bad. Some levels actually have short and sweet cutscenes, even if they're a bit pointless, but when you get humans involved, yeah, it's not that great. Now, while yes, I could just sit here and praise that every single level is absolutely amazing, one of the levels in particular didn't really hold up that well, and even in the day, I absolutely hated it. And that level has to be the Ant Cave. Right, now I'm fully aware people are going to hate me for this, but the Ant Cave is by far the worst level in this game. Now don't get me wrong, at a concept level, the Ant Cave is actually a rather good idea. Daniel has offered to help out a witch by locating items within the Ant Cave, so you have to traverse through a darkened area to find said items, as well as doing a secondary objective to locate fairies and free them. In doing so, you'll actually get a new weapon and also the chance to go back to the Hall of Heroes. And that sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? Do you really need me to answer this one? Well, there's one glaring problem with this level, and you'll notice it almost immediately. Everything looks exactly the same, which yes, on a realistic point of view, that makes sense. But in a video game, I don't think a skeleton batting people to death with its own arm means that it's going to take things seriously. Look, the level itself isn't the problem, it's rather how it looks, and in trying to defend the level, I'm guessing one of the problems it faced during development was possibly the limitations of the original PlayStation. It could be that due to a small draw distance, the level's layout became more puzzling than it really should have been, mixing a lack of any real variety, and then a draw distance that is incredibly close to you. It just ruins what could have been a decent level. But thankfully, it is an optional level, so you don't have to do it unless you want 100% the game. But just for anybody who's curious, do you want to know what you get for beating the level exactly?
I always keep my promises. I grant you my reward.
That was 40 minutes of my life wasted. That wasn't fucking worth it at all! So after a few levels and gaining a few bits and pieces, you'll eventually come across the first boss in this game, being the stained glass demon of the Hilltop Mausoleum. For a first boss, he's not actually too bad. He's pretty basic with some standard attack patterns and then just shooting his heart with your crossbow, but there's nothing all that difficult about it. It's a bit of a common theme with a lot of bosses in this game. For the most part, all of these bosses are incredibly easy to fight and you don't really have to do much. It's just avoid their attack pattern, wait for them to be vulnerable and then start shooting them with your crossbow. And after doing this loop a few times, the boss fight will be over. Now that's not to say they're identical. There's a bit of variety in how these bosses work, especially when looking at the wolves, the dragon, or even the final boss in the game. But on the other hand, some of these bosses are an absolute joke, especially the Pumpkin King. Would you even count this as a boss? I wouldn't count it as a boss, as he doesn't really do anything, he's just a really big pumpkin. Basically a boss in this game is you're just killing a giant vegetable because you were told to. Now if you actually do get to the end of the game after traversing through the entirety of Gallowmere and more, you'll actually get to the final boss, which I'd argue is probably the best boss in the game. Not just due to having multiple stages, but it also gives Zarok a bit more character development.
Bugger. Right then, that's it. I've just about had enough of your meddling. Where is that spell? Ah, yes. No, not that spell.
Yeah, there's a reason I haven't really mentioned him besides the start of the video, and that's basically because he's never ever seen in the game again after the intro. Basically in this game, you see him in the intro cutscene at the hilltop, and then that's it. He's not in the game ever again. He's just forgotten about for the entire game until right at the end they remember, oh wait, he's the antagonist, and that you have to kill him. For someone who managed to enslave an entire village and raise an army of the dead, he has basically done fuck all through this entire game. Now, to give him some credit, his boss fight, like I said earlier, is actually rather fun, and even had my head scratching at some points, because at first, I forgot how the start of this boss worked. It's been so long since I played this game that I didn't remember that you have an item in the chest which allows you to keep your skeleton crew alive, so I just kind of ran around like a headless chicken going, what am I doing here? But regardless of my lack of memory and dying multiple times due to my stupidity, the final boss in this game is great and definitely makes up for the rest of them, especially when you compare the finale to the Pumpkin King. Again, I wouldn't even count that as a boss, because he doesn't do anything. And most of all, I think for a final boss in the game, it makes the game overall feel a bit more rewarding. Once you beat him, you go back to your resting place in Dan's crypt, and that's it. Unless you get all the chalices though, because once you've done that, Dan will finally get the space he deserves in the Hall of Heroes. It's a nice touch to the end of the game, honestly. You know, this is the first time I've actually sat down and played Medieval entirely, for the first time in roughly 5 to 6 years. Now, I've come back to the game every now and again to get footage for older videos, but it was only really the first couple of levels. Sitting down and playing the entire thing from start to finish, it's kind of an eye-opener because while I do appreciate the game, and I still think it's a brilliant game, I can understand why some people don't like the controls. They're really finicky. Now look, I really can't beat around the bush here, but Medieval does suffer from some rather clunky control schemes. It's not a bad setup, it's rather, in certain scenarios, it doesn't really work as well as it could have. Take for example the combat. Close range works perfectly, Dan will just swing and hit the majority of the things he swings at. But when it comes to the ranged combat, it can be a bit finicky. You do have a sort of lock-on system that works, but only when it wants to. Instead of hitting a button on the controller for you to turn and lock onto the closest enemy, you have to be looking in the exact spot where that person is standing, and then the game has to decide if it wants to lock on for you or not. You have no choice on who it looks at if there's more than one person in the same spot. It's a rather irritating problem and does tarnish the benefits of using a ranged weapon outside of a boss fight, but I know a lot of people had more problems with the movement mechanics as well. Personally, I didn't. I think Dan controls fine, but I will admit, the jumping is a bit of a mixed bag. But I think that's due to the nature of the game being more focused around its combat and linear level design rather than being a flat out platformer, and I think the key level design in this game backs my point. Taking comparison Spyro and Crash Bandicoot. Both are great platformers with some brilliant and memorable levels, however in these games they're built around platforming being its sole gimmick. Sure, Crash and Spyro both have their attacks, but when compared to Medieval, it's nowhere near as in depth. Yet, for them two, platforming is a pretty much no-brainer and an overall smooth experience. So when you play a level like the pirate ship which has some god-awful platforming sections, I don't entirely blame the controls itself, rather the game was more focused on the key areas and making the game better in the long run, with a couple of hiccups along the way. So I think in a certain aspect, especially being when the time when this game was made, you can kind of overlook these problems, but if this was a game made today, then yeah, it would be absolutely dreadful. So after several months of trying to write a script, do I still think Medieval is a good game? Yeah, I really do. There's obviously a few things that are holding it back which makes it a little bit worse to wear over the years, but I still had a lot of fun with it, and from playing the short-lived demo earlier this month, I think the remake's in safe hands. And you can bet your sweet ass I'm coming back for the remake later this month. Sadly, I won't be able to get 2 or Resurrection done in time purely because I'm going on holiday, but that means November's just going to have even more Sir Daniel Fortescue splattered over this channel. And I can't wait to play the first game 3 times. But besides all that, thank you all so much for watching. I'm so sorry this video took so long. It's been one of these scripts that I wanted to get just right. I didn't want to rush it. But hopefully things are back on track now. You'll see more of me soon this year. And most of all, I just want to say thank you. And more importantly, have a happy Halloween.
You might try